Welcome, alums and friends. Today I'm going to talk about some of the issues in the trial of Galileo in 1633. Something that everyone's heard about Galileo's trial, but I think not many people appreciate the issues, what exactly he was charged with, the procedure, why he ended up being dragged before the Inquisition. And in this lecture, I would like, since these are University of Chicago students, I'd like to frame it in the form of a question. And the question I'd like you to consider as you learn about the facts is whether Galileo was a classical tragic hero. Now, the idea of tragedy and heroes is something that has evolved since the time of antiquity. Of course, when I talk to undergraduates now and talk about antiquity, they think I'm talking about the 1960s, but actually going back to the Greeks. So in the Greek idea of a tragic hero, it was not just something bad that happened to someone good. Aristotle wrote about the qualities of a Greek tragic hero in Poetics. And among the qualities of the Greek tragic hero, the Greek tragic hero had to be someone who was either noble or superior in some way to others. He was a person who was basically good but had a tragic flaw, and this tragic flaw led to his downfall. And the punishment he suffers is not completely deserved. It's more than he deserves. And there has to be a catharsis on the part of the audience and the hero and an understanding of what happened and why it happened and a change. So I'd like you to think about the idea of Galileo as a classical tragic hero as the lecture is developed. So let me set a little bit about the background in the case of Galileo. In about 135 in the Common Era, the Greek astronomer Ptolemy published a book, the Almagest, that was a culmination of Greek astronomy. And in this model of the universe, it was a geocentric model. Earth was at the center of the universe and immovable, and the planets and the sun and the moon revolved around, and the stars revolved around the Earth. And this was based upon Aristotle's physics, and it involved, in order to make the observations agree with the model, it involved the use of complicated things known as epicycles. So planets moved on circles, which moved on circles, which moved around the Earth. So from 135 roughly until 1600, this was the standard model of cosmology. If you had asked someone during that interval, during that 1300-year period, what is astronomy, they would have said astronomy is what's contained in Ptolemy's book, the Almagest. Ptolemy was probably the greatest scientist of antiquity. In addition to astronomy, he perfected the science of geography. And Ptolemy's book, the Almagest, and his book on geography was published into the 17th century and was the standard textbook. Of course, this view of the universe was challenged in 1543 when the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus proposed another model of the universe. Copernicus, of course, proposed a heliocentric model of the universe where the sun was immovable and at the center of the universe, and the Earth, in addition to the planets, revolved around the sun. Now, in 1543, when Copernicus proposed his model in his great book, De Revolutionibus, it didn't create much of a stir. No one really cared about it outside of a few astronomers. His book, De Revolutionibus, is described as a revolutionary book, but it was probably one of the all-time worst-selling revolutionary books. The first printing was maybe 500 books, and it was read, it was very dense, incredibly complicated and mathematical. It wasn't meant for the general public. Copernicus said astronomy is for astronomers. He wasn't interested in reaching the public. He wasn't interested in leading a revolution to get people to rethink the model of the universe. And in fact, people at the time did not really think it was important whether the sun was the center of the universe or the earth was the center of the universe. Astronomers at the time said it doesn't really matter so long as we get a way to calculate the motions of the planets, the apparent motions of the stars, that's all we want. And this was described as saving the appearances, and it was thought that the duty of an astronomer is just to make something up in order to be able to explain the observations, and whether it's actually true in nature not only is irrelevant, but it's not a question that an astronomer can possibly answer. So this is the background to when Galileo came on the scene. So let me tell you a little bit about the background of the life of Galileo and his character that led to the trial. Galileo was born in Pisa in 1564. This was the year that Michelangelo died in Florence and William Shakespeare was born in England. Giants walked the earth in those days. Galileo thought of becoming a monk in his early years, but his father persuaded him to study medicine so he could earn a living. Galileo applied to the University of Pisa for a scholarship, but the committee on the faculty of the University of Pisa thought he did not have enough promise and did not award him a scholarship. He did attend the University of Pisa, but left after 3 years without obtaining a degree. The University of Pisa later was sort of embarrassed by this and made up for it by granting him an honorary degree, but they did it 250 years after his death. After he dropped out from college, he did what you might expect. He went back home to live with his parents. He was a boomerang child, and he spent a couple of years at home, about 4 years at home, tinkering with experiments and starting to write papers on mathematics and physics, and attracted a little bit of attention. Eventually, he attracted enough attention that he was offered a low-level instructor-type position at the University of Pisa. He was appointed, his title was a professor of geometry at the University of Pisa. Now, in those days, astronomy was done within a mathematics department. In modern universities, you would find astronomers and astrophysicists embedded among physicists in a physics department, but at that time, it was in an astronomy department. It was in a mathematics department. Astronomy was considered a branch of mathematics, and what astronomers do is to come up with mathematical models to try to describe what they see in the sky without trying to understand the laws of nature behind the movements. In 1592, Galileo got a better job at the University of Padua as a professor of mathematics, and it was in Padua, where he was for 18 years until 1610, that essentially he made all of the discoveries and observations and spent the rest of his life writing them up and becoming famous. When did Galileo become a Copernican? There are surviving teaching notes from his classes at Pisa and his classes before 1609 at Padua. And in his teaching note, the book that he used and the model that he used was Ptolemy. Galileo knew about Copernicus and this other thing, but he just taught the traditional Ptolemaic astronomy. Basically, Galileo was not interested in anything that he was not working on. And, we have colleagues like this at the university. They're interested in what they're doing, and they really don't care what anyone else is doing. This is not a bad thing. You have to have focus on what you're doing, but Galileo thought there's the important things to think about, and that's exactly what I'm thinking about. But his view of the importance of cosmology seemed to change in 1608 when something seemed to fall into his lap. A Dutch optician, whose name we do not know, invented the telescope sometime around 1608. And historians argue about who invented it. About the only thing for certain is that the telescope was not invented by Galileo. But he exploited it like no one else. Probably at no time in the history of science has the right tool been in the right hands at the right time. Although he did not invent the telescope, and he didn't come up with the name telescope, Kepler came up with the name telescope, Galileo referred to it as an optic tube. He presented his optic tube to the government of Venice and offered them the exclusive right to manufacture something he did not invent in return for them doubling his salary. It worked. And before I tell you about Galileo's discoveries, I want to tell you a little bit about how crude his early telescopes were. So we think that, well, if somebody invents a telescope, they can make discoveries easily by looking into the sky. Of course, you have a new tool. The early telescopes that Galileo built could magnify distant objects by about a factor of 3. The best telescopes he had could magnify objects by about a factor of 20 to 30. And they had an extremely narrow field of view. It was looking at the universe through a soda straw. Nevertheless, so if you go to Kmart and buy the cheapest pair of binoculars you can find, the blue light special at $19.95, you would have a much better optical instrument than Galileo ever had. Nevertheless, with this relatively small increase in vision, within a couple of years, Galileo made 8 remarkable discoveries. He discovered sunspots, and that the sunspots were actually part of the surface of the sun, which other people denied. He could use the telescope and prove that there were mountains on the moon, that the moon was not a perfectly smooth surface. It was thought at this time that the surface of the moon looks like it's not smooth, but it's like looking at a smooth piece of marble, that the surface was completely smooth. It was like a piece of marble. Galileo could use the telescope, measure how shadows changed with phases of the moon, the shadows of mountains, and show that, in fact, there were mountains on the moon. He discovered the phases of Venus with the telescope. The planet Venus goes through phases like the moon does. There's the new moon, the full moon, the quarter moon. Venus does the same thing. This was not known before. Galileo discovered the rings of Saturn. He never actually resolved the rings of Saturn, but he could tell that the image of Saturn was not round. His telescope was not good enough to see that it was rings, and he described Saturn as a planet that had ears. Galileo discovered that there are stars are more distant than planets. When he looked at planets through the telescopes, they looked different. When he looked at stars through the telescope, they still looked like point-like objects. Galileo discovered stars that were invisible to the naked eye. This was remarkable. For thousands of years, humans had just assumed that with the eye, they see everything that's in the universe, that there were things that could not be seen with the naked eye. This caused, of course, theological questions. Why would God make something that people can't see? Seems like a waste of effort. He discovered that the Milky Way is made of stars, and finally, he discovered the moons of Jupiter. 8 discoveries made within a year. Any one of them would have made Galileo famous. These discoveries made with a telescope that magnified by a factor of 3 to 10. In 1610, Galileo published a book, Sidereus Nuncius, that's starry or sidereal messenger, about his discoveries, and immediately became the most famous scientist in the world. It was a phenomenal bestseller, and Galileo described all of these discoveries. It's an interesting title, Sidereus Nuncius, a Sidereal messenger. Who was the messenger? It's likely that Galileo thought that he was the messenger, that he was somehow appointed by God to make all these discoveries and present them to the rest of the world. In a book, Il Saggiatore, Galileo writes to a competitor of his, Sarsi, and says, "You cannot help it, Signor Sarsi, that it was granted to me alone to discover all the new phenomena in the sky and nothing to anybody else. This is the truth which neither malice nor envy can suppress." Galileo certainly was arrogant. He also wrote in the Dialogue, "Though the difference between man and the other animals is enormous, yet one might reasonably say that it is little less than the difference among men themselves." So back to the life of Galileo. Galileo was born in 1564 in Pisa, went to the University of Pisa, went back and lived with his parents, got a job at the University of Pisa, then a job at the University of Padua. He built the telescope. He didn't invent the telescope. He claimed that he devised the telescope, which is a clever word. He never really denied inventing the telescope. Technically, he didn't use the word invent. He said, "I devised the optic tube." You can read that either ways. So he named the moons of Jupiter after the Medici because he wanted to return to Florence. And in fact, it worked. So the Medici offered him a job as the astronomer, the mathematician, astronomer, and the philosopher to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. And he really wanted this position because he could do research without teaching. Of course, we know now that researchers should teach. We understand that. Galileo didn't understand that. But he also insisted on the title of philosopher. And this was an odd thing because astronomers were in the mathematics department. People who did natural philosophy or physics were in the philosophy department. So Galileo insisted on being called the court philosopher, made enemies among the other traditional philosophers in Florence and Pisa. And Galileo had an idea that it is the scientists who should develop and understand philosophy rather than the philosophers who read Aristotle and philosophize, saying how nature works. Galileo visited Rome in 1611. He was the toast of the town, warmly received in the Collegio Romano, the Jesuit college in Rome, and had several friendly audiences with the Pope. And Christopher Clavius, who was the chair of astronomy at Collegio Romano and the architect of the modern Gregorian calendar, professed to be an admirer of Galileo. Galileo wrote letters on sunspots in 1613, and it was clear then that he was a Copernican. Now, in 1613, the church did not have any official position on cosmology. They had the idea, well, there's the Copernican model, the Ptolemaic model. It's just astronomers playing around with models, trying to make predictions. It doesn't have anything to do with reality. But the ground under this truth seemed to be eroding faster than Galileo understood. Galileo was overbearing and arrogant and would allow neither opposition nor an ordered retreat from Ptolemaic thinking. So Galileo spent a lifetime humiliating enemies. All of his writing was polemic. People would write claiming to make discoveries. Galileo would just mercilessly attack them, saying they didn't make the discoveries, I did. And Galileo was a great writer who had the satire of Jonathan Swift and would skewer all of his enemies, and he really enjoyed this. So he spent a lifetime making enemies. One of the ideas of the classical idea of the Greek tragic hero is that when a tragedy happens, it doesn't just happen immediately. Something doesn't fall out of the sky and hit someone in the head. You can see the tragedy evolving, and the hero can see and sense what is happening. And this happened with Galileo, and it really started in 1613. It started innocently enough. In 1613, a student of Galileo, Father Castelli, was invited to breakfast at the palace. During breakfast at the palace, the Grand Duchess Christina, the mother of the Grand Duke, she was rather elderly, the mother of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, turned to Galileo's student Castelli and said, Father, your mentor and teacher Galileo claims that the earth moves, but that can't be true because Scripture says that the earth does not move and the sun moves. So Castelli tried to answer, but then went away and told Galileo about this encounter. In hindsight, Galileo could have done nothing, but Galileo was not the kind of person to have any challenge to his knowledge or authority unanswered. So he wrote a letter to Castelli. When he wrote the letter to Castelli, he realized that it would be copied and circulated. So Galileo, it was essentially a blog. And in this letter to Castelli, Galileo said, I can explain how to interpret Scripture on the basis of Copernicus. 100 years earlier, in the Council of Trent, an important position of the Catholic Church is that the church hierarchy interprets Scripture. People other than the church are forbidden to interpret Scripture. It's the job of the bureaucracy of the church, of the Catholic Church, to interpret Scripture and then explain it to people. This was in response to the Reformation. So this was a very unwise thing for Galileo to do. Galileo said, in effect, that scientists should understand nature and then use that knowledge to interpret Scripture. And the church said, no, the theologians should interpret Scripture and use that knowledge to say how science works. So there was a collision there. Galileo did not leave it at that. He enlarged the letter to Castelli into a longer letter to Christina. This was in 1613. 1615 was the letter to Christina, and Galileo's enemies pounced on this and reported him to the Department of Rome Land Security, the Inquisition. At that time, you could write the Inquisition and said, there's this guy who's doing bad things, he's a heretic, he should be anonymously, you could write to them, and he should be investigated. Galileo learned that he was, quote, under suspicion, which was a rather chilling thing to be under suspicion for heresy. At the same time, there was a Cardinal Bellarmine who wrote to another priest, Foscarini. Foscarini had written a book sort of doing the same thing that Galileo was doing, trying to interpret Scripture on the basis of Copernicanism. And Bellarmine wrote to Foscarini and said, no, you can't do this. You can only assume that it is a hypothesis. So you can talk about whatever you want. You can talk about Copernicus. You can talk about Ptolemy, but it has to be within the framework of a hypothesis. And in this letter, again, which was widely circulated, it was posted on his blog, he said, you and Galileo. So it was really something pointed to Galileo. So you can hear the ice cracking under Galileo's feet when he starts saying that scientists should interpret Scripture. So Galileo heard he was under suspicion. Galileo had friends in Rome. They said, look, you're in trouble. So Galileo said, I will go to Rome and straighten all this out. I will explain everything to the cardinals, to the theologians. Everything's going to be okay. It was a disaster. Because Galileo pushed the issue, the Pope asked the father theologians of the Congregation of the Holy Office to consider two issues. The first issue is that the sun is the center of the world and altogether immovable in motion. The second issue is that Earth is not the center, and in fact, that the Earth spins on its axis and goes around the sun. So then in 1616, the church made a decision that Ptolemy was correct based upon their interpretation of Scripture. Galileo forced the church to consider this. The church considered it and came to the conclusion, on the basis of their interpretation of Scripture, that Ptolemy was correct, that the earth was stationary and the sun moves. How did they come to this conclusion? Because that's actually what it says in Scripture. It was a literal interpretation of Scripture. The Pope instructed Cardinal Bellarmine to call Galileo before him and instruct him not to teach Copernicanism. And the Pope did that. Cardinal Bellarmine did that. So Galileo went back to Florence in 1613 in complete defeat. And there were rumors around that he had been forced to abjure, that he had to do penance. And he wrote to Cardinal Bellarmine saying, please write a letter clearing my name. And Bellarmine did write a letter, and he wrote a letter to Galileo, again, that was circulated. And in the letter to Galileo, Bellarmine said, you have not had penance imposed upon you. You have not been forced to abjure. You've only been told that you cannot hold or defend Copernicanism. This was in 1616. And the next day, the Holy Congregation of the Index of Prohibited Books issued a decrease banning De Revolutionibus. And legally, it was a sweeping decree. They also said, we also ban any book that treats Copernicanism. So it wasn't just book by book. Any book that treated Copernicanism was put on the Index of Forbidden Books. 16 years later, in 1632, Galileo published a dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. This led to him being dragged before the Inquisition. Why did Galileo do this? Well, between 1616 and 1632, the faces had changed. Bellarmine died in 1621. The Pope, Paul V, died, succeeded by Gregory XV, who lived 2 years, and then succeeded by a close personal friend of Galileo, Maffeo Cardinal Barberini, who took the name of Urban VIII. Galileo was well acquainted with Barberini. Barberini had been a patron of Galileo. Barberini had written poetry in praise of Galileo. He would write letters to Galileo and sign them as your brother. They were clearly close personal friends. Galileo dedicated his next book, Il Saggiatore, to Pope Urban VIII. The Pope loved the book so much, for entertainment, he would have the book read to him at dinner. The Pope appointed as his chief of staff a former pupil of Galileo. So Galileo figured, all this trouble is behind me. Now I have friends in high places. I can do whatever I want. It was a tragic misunderstanding. Einstein commented on Galileo and said, creative individuals are often not receptive. A quote that Einstein actually could have written about himself. So Galileo told the Pope that I'm going to write this book, Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems. The Pope said, okay. And Galileo would send letters to the Pope saying, I've finished the first 3 chapters. I'm here. It took him a few years to write it. He kept the Pope informed of his progress. So the book finally appeared in 1632, and it was written in dialogue form. It was a dialogue between 3 characters, Salviati, Sagredo, and the person who took the side of Ptolemy, who argued for the Ptolemaic model. Galileo gave the name Simplicio. Simplicio was a pompous philosopher, dropping Latin phrases clearly without knowing what they were about. And Galileo just couldn't resist the name, and Galileo took out 30 years of frustration on poor Simplicio. Simplicio is an idiot, and he's written as an idiot. So in this several hundred-page book, Simplicio says Ptolemy has to be right because of this, and Salviati just cuts him to pieces. Finally, Simplicio falls back on an argument, quote, that I heard from a most eminent and learned person. The argument is God can arrange the universe any way he pleases, and we will never understand it. This was a statement and a word-for-word retelling of the position of the Pope. And the Pope was a very proud person, and you could imagine reading his words spoken by Simplicio. Why in the world Galileo did this, I have no idea. The dialogue was an immediate bestseller, unlike De Revolutionibus, and events unfolded rapidly. In February of 1632, the dialogue is printed. In the summer, the distribution was stopped by Urban. Urban banned the book, and you wouldn't believe what happened when the book was banned. Its popularity increased. How could you have predicted that banning a book makes people want to buy it and read it? Who could figure that out? In September, and in the summer, the Pope authorized a special commission to examine the book, and in the summer, based upon this commission report, the Pope referred the case to the Inquisition. In October, Galileo received a summons to appear before the Inquisition in Rome. Galileo, of course, being a smart legal guy, said, well, why don't I appear in Florence, where I live, where I have all these friends? That change of venue was denied. Then in December, Galileo sent a note from 3 doctors saying the guy's 70 years old, he's very sick, traveling to Rome is very difficult, trains go on strike. And that was refused also, and the Inquisition said, you can come on your own or you will be dragged here in chains. So in 1633, in February, Galileo arrived in Rome and was allowed to stay at the home of the Tuscan ambassador. And it wasn't until April that the deposition started. So let me say just a couple of words about the worst case scenario. On February 16, 1600, after 8 years of trial and imprisonment, in part for teaching that there are other planets, there are stars out there that have other planets around them, something that we've learned in the last 10 years, Giordano Bruno was awakened before dawn, stripped of his clothes, thrown in the back of the cart, and there was a concern that as he goes through the streets of Rome, he could say things that people shouldn't hear, so his tongue was nailed to the roof of his mouth, and he was taken to Campo di Fiori in Rome and burned at the stake. That's the worst case scenario that Galileo was facing. Now, we have access to the complete records in the Galileo affair. The complete records from the Vatican Archives are online. The Catholic Church is a bureaucracy. It is not in the habit of bureaucracies to publicize proceedings that are embarrassing. Every bureaucracy tries to keep things secret. Why do we have access to every document, all of the depositions of the trial of Galileo? It was, of course, because of Napoleon. Napoleon liked to take vacations in Italy with his army, and when he was in Rome on vacation, he visited the Vatican Archives and said, "Excuse me, I'd like to take all of the Galileo material back to Paris. You don't mind, do you?" Why Napoleon was interested in Galileo? Well, the Catholic Church was powerful in France. It was clear that Napoleon wanted something to make the church uncomfortable. Napoleon said, "I'm going to publish all this information about Galileo." The church was not happy about this, but when you're in Rome with an army, there's not much you can do to tell them no. So Napoleon took all the material back to Paris. The project, he never did publish it. The Vatican kept saying, "We want our stuff back, we want our stuff back." Finally, in 1845, the French agreed to return the material to the Vatican if they promised to publish everything, which they did. It took them 139 years to get around to it, but eventually they published it. So we have access to every word in all of the depositions and in the trial of Galileo. The Pope assured Galileo's friends that he would do everything he could to help Galileo, but what can I do? I'm just the Pope. The Inquisition's doing this, and this is at best disingenuous. The Pope appointed the people to judge Galileo and stocked it with his enemies. It's clear that the Pope was the invisible hand behind the trial of Galileo. But the church had a problem, had a legal issue. What did Galileo do that was wrong? On the next page, after the title page of the dialogue, is a long list of imprimatur signatures. The church had signed off on the book. Galileo had presented it to the censors and said, "Is it okay to publish this?" And the church, 5 or 6 of them signed saying, "Yes, it's okay to censor it." How can the church punish someone, or any bureaucracy punish for someone for doing something that they said he could do? So it wasn't a clear-cut legal issue. So let's see how it unfolds. The entire Galileo trial is in about 5 typewritten pages. It did not drag on for months and months and months like modern trials. It was over in about 5 pages and involved 4 depositions. The first deposition was on April 12, 1633. Galileo had arrived in Rome in February, and they kept Galileo on ice a couple of months. And in the first deposition was sort of straightforward that you might expect in a trial. They ask, first of all, they ask, "Do you know why you were here?" Just like when the policeman pulls you over and asks, "Do you know why I stopped you? Do you know why you were here?" Galileo says, "Well, I guess it's something to do about this book." And they say, "What is the book about?" Galileo says what the book's about. They give Galileo a copy. "Do you recognize this book? Did you write it?" etc. They establish the legal formalities. Then they get right to the crux of the matter. They ask Galileo, "Were you in Rome in 1616? And Galileo says, "Yes, I was in Rome in 1616. I came here to learn what I should hold about Copernicus or Ptolemy." Then the inquisitor asks, "Did anyone give you an injunction?" And Galileo says, "Well, I wasn't given a piece of paper, but Bellarmine told me I couldn't hold or defend Copernicus." And the church keeps pushing. "Were you given an injunction? What was the exact words that Bellarmine told you 16 years earlier?" The church, of course, had the report of Bellarmine of the conversation with Galileo. Now, there is some controversy among historians whether this report is actually given by Bellarmine, or did the church fabricate this in order to try Galileo? So it could be, some historians believe that in fact Galileo was innocent and the church just manufactured evidence to try to get him, and Galileo was a completely innocent victim, just like Blagojevich. The church read the injunction to Galileo and said the words are, quote, cannot hold, defend, or teach in any way whatsoever. Galileo says, well, I don't really remember those words. I remember hold or defend. I don't remember teach or the words in any way whatsoever. And there's back and forth, why don't you remember this? And Galileo said, well, it was told to me 17 years ago. I really don't remember the exact words. Oh, and by the way, I have this letter from Bellarmine that he introduces in evidence. The words teach does not appear in this letter, and the words in any way whatsoever does not appear in the letter. So here is the issue. Galileo says, well, it's just about holding or defending Copernicus. I didn't do that. It's a book written in dialogue form. I present both sides of the issue. Galileo said my presentation was fair and balanced. But the church said, in fact, you were told not to teach it in any way whatsoever. So it's 5 words, 6 words. That's the crux of the difference between Galileo and the church. Then this first deposition ends suddenly when Galileo, of course, who did not have an attorney to represent him, and reading the depositions, Galileo did not know when to shut up. Reminds you, anyone who defends himself has a fool for a client and an attorney. It was true for Galileo also. Galileo says, no, you don't understand the book. The book is actually defending Ptolemy. What? Suddenly the questions end. They say, okay, you can go. Now, why would someone think that Galileo was defending Copernicus? Galileo says, in the book I show contrary to Copernicus's opinion and show that Copernicus's reasons are invalid and inconclusive. The Inquisition may have not caught on to this subtlety because in the dialogues, Galileo at different times referred to those who thought that the earth was stationary as imbeciles, mental pygmies, dumb idiots, people hardly deserving to be called human beings, and people who were too stupid to recognize their own limitations. This was the side he was defending, obviously. So the Inquisition really didn't know about this. They sent Galileo back, scratched their head figuring out what to do. Then 2 weeks later, Galileo says, I want to make a statement. So Galileo comes in and says, since the last deposition, I went back and reread the book. Now I understand why you think I was defending Copernicus. Because actually Copernicus is obviously so wrong, I wanted to show off and prove how smart I am by making the Copernican case stronger than it actually is. And then he comes back later, then he says, that's all, they said, okay, you can go. And he comes back later that day and says, okay, I'll tell you what I do. I come up with another edition in the book and I fix everything. Can I go now? This is probably a measure of the hopelessness and desperation of Galileo. So the church had time on their side. Galileo was sweating it out. And remember, Bruno was on trial for 8 years. They were just waiting for Galileo. And finally, after a month, they run out of patience and they say, Galileo, you have 8 days to make a defense, and Galileo comes back with a defense. Galileo's defense is he did not recall hearing the words teaching or in any way whatsoever. He said, all I had to do was to go by Bellarmine's letter. I did not have to tell the censors anything about this injunction I was given by Bellarmine because I shouldn't be treated any different than anyone else. I have this letter from Bellarmine saying the church's position is it couldn't be held or defended. And Galileo says, my only error was ambition in trying to appear smarter than everyone else. Finally, Galileo talks about the pitiable state of his health, his old age, and his reputation. He throws himself on the mercy of the court. There's a fourth deposition that's only one page. On 21 June 1633, the Inquisition calls Galileo back and asks them, essentially, are you now or have you ever been a Copernican? Galileo says, I was unsure of Copernicus before 1616, but once the church told me what was right, I was a committed Ptolemaic. I did not believe in Copernicus. The church says you are presumed to hold the opinion of Copernicus. Galileo says, I have not held the said opinion. The church says, we think you hold that opinion, and by the way, we have, quote, recourse to remedies of the law and appropriate steps. Galileo again says, I do not hold the opinion. The church says, just in case Galileo did not catch on what remedies of the law were, the Inquisition says, we have recourse to torture. Galileo says, I have not held the opinion of Copernicus. For the rest, I am in your hands. Do as you please. That was the trial of Galileo. The next day, on 22 June 1633, was one of the most tragic episodes in the struggle for human freedom. Early in the morning, the 70-year-old Galileo was dressed in the white robes of penitence, led down the narrow corridors of the Dominican convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, made to kneel before the altar, before the Father Inquisitions, before the entire world, and the sentence was read to him. In part, the sentence reads, we say, pronounce sentence, and declare that you, Galileo, by reason of these things which have been detailed in the trial, in which you have confessed already, have rendered yourself, according to this holy office, vehemently suspect of heresy, naming of having held and believed a doctrine that is false and contrary to the divine and holy Scripture, namely that the sun is the center of the world and does not move from east to west. After having the sentence read to him, Galileo was forced to abjure. In part, he said, desiring to remove from the minds of your eminences and all faithful Christians this vehement suspicion justly conceived against me, with sincere heart and unfeigned faith, I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies. Tradition has it that after reciting this, Galileo sprang to his feet and defiantly cried out, Eppur si muove. Nevertheless, it moves. There is no way that Galileo would have done this. A small footnote on this tragic episode is that 200 years later, when it was published, it was discovered that the decision apparently was not unanimous. There were 10 cardinals investigating Galileo. The decision was signed by only 7 cardinals. Could be that 3 of them were on vacation or didn't get around to it. That's very unlikely. This was a serious matter. So it was presumably a 7-3 decision. Galileo was sentenced to life imprisonment in the prisons of the Inquisition. Galileo's friends interceded, and the Pope publicly said, I'm so magnanimous, I will change Galileo's sentence from life imprisonment in the dungeons of the Inquisition to life imprisonment under house arrest. So the Pope, who had engineered everything, could now appear magnanimous. And the house arrest was very strictly supervised. He was forbidden to even discuss or write anything about Copernicus. His correspondence was examined, and visits by former students were prohibited. And his great book was placed on the Index of Forbidden Books, where it would remain until 1824. In the last days of Galileo's life, there was some hope that he would be pardoned before his death, so he could be given a proper burial. In a remarkable insight into human nature, Galileo wrote, "I do not expect a commutation of the sentence because I have not committed any crime. I could expect forgiveness and pardon if I were guilty, but a man who is innocent must be treated without pardon to prove that the accuser was right." Galileo died on the evening of January 8, 1642. It wasn't until 1637 that Galileo was moved from a virtually unmarked grave to a prominent location in the church of Santa Croce in Florence, across the aisle from Michelangelo, diagonally across from Dante. Not such shabby company. For 200 years until 1835, the dialogue remained on the Index of Forbidden Books, the list of books that was so dangerous that just reading it could imperil your immortal soul. That is the story of Galileo's trial, and now I ask you the question, was Galileo a classical, tragic hero in the sense of Aristotle and the Greeks? Thank you very much.